In 1930, a new Air Corps era began with the dedication of Randolph Field at San Antonio, Texas. As headquarters for the Air Corps Training Center, it soon developed into one of its more important bases. It was at Randolph that many of America's World War II Eagles learned to fly. The winter of '32 was a man-killer in the Southwest. Navajo tribes were snowbound in Arizona without food and other necessities. The 11th Bomb Squadron from March Field was sent to help. Traveling at 133 miles an hour in open cockpits at 0 temperatures, the V-2 Condor crews dropped 15 tons of supplies. It was a unique act of humanitarianism. Machines designed to destroy an enemy were saving Native Americans. On the fateful dawn of September 1st, 1939, Hitler directed the German Army and Air Force in a lightning-like campaign against Poland. Without warning, 2,000 modern German combat planes took off for the first aerial blitzkrieg in history. While American pilots were flying missions of mercy at home, an ominous voice was heard in Europe. Many laughed at Adolf Hitler as he and his Nazi party were coming into power. But with a highly mobile army, the Wehrmacht, and a well-equipped air force, the Luftwaffe, Germany posed a great threat to world peace. In the meantime, the U.S. was developing faster and more powerful aircraft, the B-9, the P-26, and the B-10. An excellent trial for the new B-10s came in 1934, when Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold led 30 officers and enlisted men on a long-range test flight from Washington, D.C. to Alaska. On the return trip from Juneau to Seattle, the crews flew 990 miles non-stop through fog and rainstorms. Thus, as early as 1934, the Air Corps demonstrated that it was technically possible for an enemy to attack the United States from the Arctic. When the volcano Mauna Loa on Hawaii suddenly became active, the government called on the Army Air Corps to bomb the lava flow and try to save Hilo City. 5 Keystone bombers dropped 6,000 pounds of high explosives on the lava stream and its source. 2 days after the bombing, the river of fire slowed, then stopped completely, and Hilo City was saved by air power. In March 1935, the Army set up 3 combat wings, one at Langley Field, Virginia, for the east, one at Marchfield, California, with aerial forces to protect the west, and one at Barksdale Field, Louisiana. Thus, the nation was provided with small, mobile air forces that could spot and intercept hostile forces before they could get within striking distance. And if necessary, planes could be dispatched to reinforce American bases in Hawaii, Panama, or Alaska. Control of this tactical force was centralized for the first time under the newly formed General Headquarters, Air Force. In the interests of scientific research, an historic balloon flight was made on Armistice Day, November 11, 1935, from the Stratobowl in South Dakota. Piloted by Captains Albert Stevens and Orville Anderson, the world's largest balloon reached the greatest height man had so far attained, 14 miles. They landed after 8 hours and brought back valuable knowledge on weather, cosmic rays, radio, and mapping, a profitable scientific expedition. Weather conditions in the spring of 1936 produced unprecedented floods in the eastern states. 30 B-10 bombers with 45 officers and nearly 100 enlisted men were sent to help the victims. They dropped 8,000 pounds of medicine, clothing, and food to the stricken communities. The Air Corps played a major role in alleviating human suffering by quickly converting its weapons of war to wings of mercy. Meanwhile, Japan was making a bid for world power through an undeclared war against China. Japanese pilots were training for Pearl Harbor with a relatively modern air force that ruled the skies over China. At the same time, Italy was testing her air force in a campaign against Ethiopia. The American press raised a valid question. Why was U.S. air power falling behind Germany, France, Italy, Russia, and Britain? The War Department had an answer. the nation was not devoting sufficient money to aircraft development. But the Air Corps was planning an aerial dreadnought of tremendous capabilities, the four-engine B-17, later known as the Flying Fortress. The Boeing company delivered the first B-17s to the 2nd Bomb Group in the spring of 1937. The new airplane gave the U.S. an unprecedented bombardment capability. On February 17, 1938, with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Olds in charge, the Air Corps dispatched 6 Flying Fortresses on a goodwill flight to South America. After visiting Argentina, Chile, Panama, and Peru, the bombers returned to the United States and landed at Langley Field, Virginia. All 49 men who participated were saluted for their skill in accomplishing the 10,000-mile mission. On March 11, 1938, German mechanized forces escorted by 400 aircraft crossed the Austrian border. Hitler himself followed the next day and formally swallowed up the Republic of Austria. On September 30th, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed. Without firing a shot or dropping a bomb, Hitler's military machine had won a great victory. The next day, 500 German aircraft took part in the invasion of the Sudetenland. Appeasement left Hitler free to conquer Czechoslovakia. Yet British Prime Minister Chamberlain believed he had achieved peace in our time. In 1939, President Roosevelt requested a larger defense appropriation for expansion of U.S. air power. First and foremost was concern with increased aircraft production. Training was also stepped up at Randolph Field in Texas to build a pool of reserve pilots. There were intensive studies in meteorology, navigation, radio, and air regulations. On completion of the training, most of the cadets were sworn in and commissioned as second lieutenants in the Air Corps Reserve. Rigid training converted raw recruits into men physically and mentally fit to defend the nation. On the fateful dawn of September 1st, 1939, Hitler directed the German Army and Air Force in a lightning-like campaign against Poland. Without warning, 2,000 modern German combat planes took off for the first aerial blitzkrieg in history. With this earth-shattering overture, played by Stuka bombers, World War II began. In early 1940, Hitler's forces, led by the Luftwaffe, began to overrun the map of Europe, across Denmark and Norway, then southward over Holland and Belgium toward France. The Luftwaffe repeated its Polish success as it paved the way for advancing panzers that overcame 3.5 million French soldiers. The Luftwaffe appeared invincible. The U.S. was forced to respond. President Roosevelt said, "I should like to see this nation geared to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." This meant speeding up from 2,000 planes a year to more than 4,000 planes a month. Many said it was impossible, but American industry rose to the challenge. After the French surrender, only the British Royal Air Force remained for the Luftwaffe to conquer. As German aircraft crossed the Channel, the Royal Air Force sprang to England's defense. A modest but well-trained force of British airmen, equipped with Spitfires and Hurricanes, fought back. The best the Luftwaffe had to offer was knocked out of the sky. Then Hitler switched to night raids. But the Luftwaffe's final effort was desperate and doomed to failure. Britain's airmen fought furiously, and England was saved. Half a world away, at dawn, December 7th, 1941, a Japanese air task force headed for Oahu, Hawaii. Mission: sneak attack. Primary targets: Pearl Harbor, Hickam Field, and Wheeler Field. Wave after wave of Japanese planes bombed American aircraft and units of the Pacific Fleet in an attack that achieved amazing tactical surprise. Although America paid heavily for being unprepared, the U.S. Army Air Forces, led by men like General Hap Arnold, began to rise from disaster. Hap Arnold said, We are faced with a tough job, but I know that we can do it. And with all due reverence, I say, by God, we will do it. The Flying Tigers met the Imperial Japanese Air Force, which was then victoriously sweeping Pacific skies. The Japanese were defeated, and 60% of their force was destroyed. "24 hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt addressed the nation. I ask that Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. General Douglas MacArthur, head of the Army forces in the Far East, was faced with furious aerial attacks on the Philippines. The Japanese bombed the islands heavily and destroyed half the total American bombing force and over half the fighter force in the Philippines. The remaining American aircraft fought back against overwhelming odds, but the Japanese drove the Americans out of the Philippines. In China, at Kunming, Claire Chennault had 84 pilots in the American volunteer group that later became known popularly as the Flying Tigers. Their mission? To engage and destroy Japanese aircraft. The Japanese, based at Hanoi, 350 miles away, headed for Kunming on December 20th to attack the untried American flyers. The Flying Tigers met the Imperial Japanese Air Force, which was then victoriously sweeping Pacific skies. The Japanese were defeated, and 60% of their force was destroyed. 4 months later, another group of volunteers, flying B-25s and led by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, took off from the aircraft carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo from the sea. Factories in Tokyo were turning out munitions tagged for Corregidor, Midway, and Dutch Harbor. One after another, the American bombers checked off their targets: tank factories, shipyards, docks, railroad yards, steel plants, gunpowder factories. The raid was an omen of the eventual destruction to be heaped on Japan from the air. In the spring of 1942, the Axis powers were winning the war. The Allies faced their gravest crisis as Nazi and Japanese officers met in Germany to plan a victorious meeting of their armies in Asia. In those bleak days of 1942, German forces pushed toward Japan. Relentlessly, the Axis pincers threatened to close in Central Asia. By May 15th, the Navy had intercepted communications that detailed a Japanese plan to invade Midway and points in the Aleutians. The Army and Navy decided to attempt an intercept of the Japanese Navy at Midway. The Japanese fleet, more than 80 warships, advanced, some steaming north toward Alaska, the main body converging on Midway. Navy, Marine, and Army Air Force fighters and bombers were on constant alert. The battle took place between the 3rd and 5th of June. U.S. Navy aircraft attacked from 3,600 feet, then went down and scraped the decks. One by one, the Japanese ships caught fire. Besides 8 auxiliary vessels, the Japanese lost 4 carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 3 destroyers, along with 275 aircraft and 4,800 men. Midway was perhaps the most important battle of the Pacific Naval War. Here, the carrier airplane proved itself an effective defensive weapon against attacking surface forces. In April through June of 1942, men of the 8th Air Force, 10,000 strong, left for England on the Queen Elizabeth. The 8th Air Force was preparing for daylight precision bombing, although the British pursued night area bombing, having suffered heavy losses in daylight operations. On the 17th of August, the 8th Bomber Command loaded up for the first U.S. raid from England in U.S. planes in daylight. The target was the marshalling yard near Rouen. Visibility was excellent, something the British didn't get for night bombing. the 12 planes dropped a total of 37,000 pounds of bombs with good accuracy. 2 of the planes collected flak, but all of them evaded the German fighters and returned to England intact. On the other side of the world, the Japanese drive toward Port Moresby, one of the few bases the Allies still held north of Australia, threatened to push the Allies into the sea. MacArthur ordered troops rushed into battle by air. To support the 10,000 American and Australian troops flown over the mountains, air transports delivered supplies at the rate of over 4 million pounds in 10 weeks. On December 27th, the Japanese attacked. 12 brand new P-38s were dispatched to intercept the invading force of 28 Zeros and bombers. When the score was finally added up, the P-38s had claimed 11 Japanese fighters and bombers shot down. The P-38 made a dramatic debut in Southwest Pacific operations. At the same time, in North Africa, the veteran battle-trained Luftwaffe was confident of easy victory over inexperienced American air units. Luftwaffe pilots attacked Allied supply harbors and airfields. The Allies suffered heavy losses. In February of 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps attacked. After 8 days of attack, the Axis initiative was exhausted. The Allies squeezed the Axis forces into a steadily smaller pocket, and the Germans relied on aerial transport planes to bring in supplies and move key personnel back to Sicily. On Palm Sunday, 100 Nazi armed transports headed back to their Sicilian sanctuary, escorted by a group of more than 30 fighters. An Allied force spotted them, and a flight of 13 P-40s with RAF Spitfires flying cover dove on the German transports to split them up. When the attack was over, Allied aircraft had destroyed 58 German transports and 18 fighters. This was indicative of the Allied air superiority, which ultimately led to the defeat of Rommel's Afrika Korps. In the Far East, on another front, supplies were barely trickling through to General Chennault's 14th Air Force. The situation called for flying the hump, carrying supplies from India over the Himalayas into China. C-46s and 47s carried tons of food and medicine, gasoline and bombs over the highest mountains in the world. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Bomber Command in England prepared 376 B-17s for an attack on 2 critical targets, the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, both deep in Germany. Destruction of these targets would greatly affect Germany's capacity to wage war. There was no doubt it would bring on a large-scale and costly air battle. As soon as the bombers got into formation over Britain, they were picked up by German radar. The Luftwaffe plotted the American course and sent up German fighters to intercept the B-17s. In spite of fierce opposition, which destroyed 24 bombers, the 4th Bomb Wing severely damaged the Nazis' Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, dropping over 300 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The 1st Bomb Wing successfully bombed Schweinfurt, and although the Nazis knocked 36 bombers out of the sky, the B-17s never broke formation. The bombers delivered 400 tons of high explosives, getting 80 hits on the 2 main ball-bearing plants. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg operations were costly to the Allies, but proved to be a severe blow to German war efforts. In the Pacific, with Allied forces firmly holding northeast New Guinea and the Solomons, General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey could now threaten Rabaul, the Japanese main supply center on New Britain Island. The objective was to neutralize planes and anti-aircraft guns, smash the airdromes around Rabaul, and destroy the concentration of military shipping in Simpson Harbor. B-25 bombers flying low to avoid detection went in first to hit Japanese airfields. Paving the way for the attack on the harbor, American fighters ran into more than 40 Japanese interceptors. At Rabaul, American forces bombed 24 ships, strafed 17, and destroyed over 100 Japanese aircraft, mostly on the ground. In the space of 12 minutes, a formidable Japanese sea and air armada was attacked and decisively defeated. In England, the 8th Air Force planned for a massive attack on German industry. October 9th, 1943, the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Marienburg, the Arado factory at Anklam, shipyards at Danzig, and port facilities at Gdynia. The routes were carefully plotted to minimize flak and fighter interference. The going was rough, but the bombers got through and pounded Anklam, Gdynia, Danzig, Marienburg. All work in these German war plants came to a sudden and violent stop or was severely reduced. The 12th Air Force, forged in Africa, tempered in Pantelleria, and bloodied in Sicily, now faced a big test in Italy, which was defended by 24 tough German divisions. The defeat of Germany's forces called for steady ground pressure synchronized with strong airstrikes. Blocking the way to Rome were minefields and occupied villages protected by tanks. From mountain to mountain, village to village, the action was bitter. At the Battle of the Abbey of Monte Cassino, American aircraft bombed the observation post and the heavily fortified town of Cassino. Within 7 weeks, air power choked off the German supply line, and the Fifth Army cracked the Gustav Line. The road to Rome was opened at last, and the Eternal City opened its arms.